Let's get started now. Welcome to today's Lunch with a Local, and I'd like to welcome today's guest, Elizabeth Close. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which each of us meet today. For me, this is the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. The format today is that I'll be asking some questions to Elizabeth, and very much looking forward to finding out more about her work and the background to that. And if you do have some questions yourself that you'd like to ask to Elizabeth, just use the chat feature. If you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a feature there where you can type in with chat. If you just type in some questions, we'll be able to put those to Elizabeth and hear the results. And also I'll let you know that we're recording this today so that we can share it after the event. With all those details out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Yanyi Close. Elizabeth is an Anangu woman from the Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara language groups. Her family comes from the APY lands. Elizabeth's background is in both nursing as an emergency department nurse and in art as well. In recent years, she's installed over 30 large-scale public murals across Adelaide. No doubt you've seen some of them, and some as far away as France, which was exciting to see last year. So welcome, Elizabeth, and maybe we could just start about, tell us how you got into art.
Thanks for having me. Gosh, well, I think it was a bit of a unorthodox sort of entry into art. So I actually failed art at school. I failed at year 8 art because I didn't. I can't remember the exact way it was framed, or wouldn't engage in structured art activities, I think. So I kind of gave that up and thought, oh, this really isn't for me. And so I went on sort of later on in high school and then on into university to go into a career in health and did a Bachelor of Nursing. And then I kind of went off the rails a little bit, I guess, a couple of years into my practice as a registered nurse, because my grandmother passed away. And my grandmother was, I guess, a very, very important cultural link for me. And I really just sort of fell apart. And I took a bit of it, like I said, went off the rails a bit and sort of just, crashed and burnt. But then I started to try and process that grief through something that she and I used to share. And she was a very, very talented drawer and painter. And she used to make pottery and do painting and drawing. We used to do that sort of stuff together, and sewing and lots of other creative stuff. So I guess I kind of turned to that as a means to process my grief. And through that, I created some works that really explored that. And then, created a few more. And then I, colleagues at work that, really liked my work, and a couple of them, purchased works, and I gave them away freely. And then I think I've got an email about an exhibition called Our Mob, which is an annual exhibition that happens in Adelaide at the Festival Centre. And I thought, well, why not? And so I just threw my hat in the ring, and lo and behold, I was shortlisted. And so I guess that kind of gave me a bit of, impetus to kind of continue on. And so I just really gradually built up, I guess, a small, hobbyist arts practice. And then I went on to have my first baby, which was a big surprise because we certainly weren't planning one. And he came along, and then I sort of started to paint from the perspective and through that lens of motherhood and what it means to, be an Aboriginal mother, and to, take a lot of those, those parenting, almost like frameworks and ideologies that, what it means to be, an Anangu woman, what it means to be Anangu babies, and how we raise them, and started to paint from that kind of perspective. And so very, very gradually, and then I had, and I had another child, and then I had another one. And so, very gradually built up an arts practice that, became, I was still working part-time as an emergency nurse at Flinders. And, after so my husband and my then 2 children, we moved back to the APY lands for a period of time, and then came back. And then sort of after that and around that time, is I guess where I sort of saw my practice from going as, you know, very much a part-time hobbyist arts practice to building something much bigger. And then, you know, sort of about 4 years ago, you know, was able to build it to a point where it's a full-time arts practice now.
And in talking about sort of building it in scale, is it fair to say that this started on canvas work?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much canvas, very humble canvas beginnings.
So how do you move from a canvas to the walls?
Yeah. So I, through happenstance and chance more than anything. So we had just moved back from the APY back to Adelaide. And again, I was still, it was very much, canvas arts practice. And a friend of mine who I knew from, we both had babies around the same age, her sister was running something called the Little Rundle Street Art Project, which was sort of run, it would have been, that'd be 5 or 6 years ago now. Little Rundle Street in Kent Town, there was a big movement about creating street art in that laneway, and it was like a fringe event. And you know, the woman that owned the Tin Cat Cafe, which is now closed unfortunately in Kent Town, she was orchestrating it and running it all. And her sister said, you know, do you want to try your hand at some street art? And I went, hell yeah, I do. You know, I'd relish the challenge. And so gave me the opportunity, you know, gave me 2 walls, in fact. One of them was quite big. It was 1,000 square meters. It was a big wall. And so they were both unpaid opportunities, but, you know, I just really, you know, wanted to, you know, give it a go. And it seemed like a challenge. And, you know, I got to use a scissor lift, even though I was unlicensed, because I didn't even know you needed a license. I since have my license. I'm completely legit now, but anyway. And so, yeah, I did it, and I just, I got bitten by the bug, and I've, loved it ever since.
Yes. And is there a different approach? Like, is it just a canvas work that's bigger, or is it a whole different way of thinking of an artwork?
I think all public artists and street artists and muralists will probably approach it differently. But I think in essence, you know, certainly from my perspective, I created a concept piece and I scaled it up. And, you know, so it was just about, you know, and I didn't even know that what I was doing was what street artists do. Like, I didn't even realize that, I guess, like the maths tricks that I was doing and the way that I was, you know, scaling it up is just exactly the basic premise of their practice. You know, I was thinking that this is, I'm, you know, some complete amateur novice street artist, and I had no idea what I was doing. And, you know, I've come to realize that everyone's kind of muddled through like that until suddenly they do sort of feel like they know what they're doing a little bit and do know how to, you know, scale it up. But yeah, I created a concept and I just scaled it up.
Yeah. And can somebody learn to be a street artist? Because it's interesting you mentioned you've had a very organic approach to your art.
Yeah.
Maybe there's not a formal background, but and then that organically moved into street art. Like,
I think you can. I mean, I've learned, and certainly, like you every job you have, inevitably something goes wrong, and you learn from it and you build upon it. But I've learned. So, and I know that, you know, a lot of street artists that I work with now that work at a really high level, you know, have muddled through, because it's not like it's something you necessarily, I mean, I didn't go to art school, so I can't speak from my own personal experience, but, you know, I've obviously got a lot of colleagues, artists that have, and I guess there really isn't any kind of pathway to learn to be a street artist. It is something that kind of happens organically, and it's something you have to, I think it is probably something that's one of those last, you know, vestibules of art where you can't, it is something that you kind of just have to muddle through and learn on the job. But, you know, because it's got, and there's like a number of different ways that you can approach it. And if you think about street art and where it comes from, you know, it's got a background in, you know, graffiti and that sort of, you know, young anarchist vandalism, you know, where there's no formal way to learn that. You learn that on the streets, and you learn that in the rail corridor, and you know, that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I guess I hadn't really considered considered it like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've got a question from Jake about this interaction between graffiti and street art. So the question that Jacob has is, can you comment on how street art helps combat graffiti? And if I can append to it that interplay between the two, it's, I don't know if there's
interesting. It's really interesting. Absolutely. Do you know, it's really funny because there is honour among vandals and there is respect, and there's very much like creation of street art. You know, there's a saying, you know, in our industry, it's permissioned and commissioned. If it's been permissioned and commissioned, it generally doesn't get touched, and if it does, it's generally like little texted tags from, you know, 12-year-old vandals that really don't necessarily kind of know the code yet. And so it does significantly decrease, you know, vandalism and graffiti. And so like walls that are, you know, blank walls that just get, you see them at train stations, they just get constantly tagged. And so, you know, Dipty will like, you know, dutifully come and roll over it with Dipty olive green or whatever it's called. And yet, you know, you come back next week and there's another one. I just recently finished a project at the Goodwood train station with two other artists, Shane Cook and Thomas Ridette. And we went away, we finished the work, went away and came back to get some finished shots, and the entire like subway where we hadn't painted, so we painted, there's like one big entryway on one side of the subway, one on the other side, and then there's like two where it goes up to the platforms. None of that had been touched. The only place where there were big like spray tags were on the blank walls. And so, you know, obviously people have come there, people have had the opportunity to really like take task and mess our work up, but they haven't, because, you know, there is that respect and that, you know, mutual understanding of, you know, how things are. Yeah.
And there's a number of street artists that I've met who've actually come from the group.
Oh yeah, and overwhelmingly, like there's, you know, more street. I mean, it's, you know, I guess that's evolving and that's changing, and there are more artists, I guess, like myself that have come to it from, you know, a non-graffiti background, or, you know, have come to it as from an art school background. But yeah, like overwhelmingly, you know, if I look at all of the prolific street artists that I can think of the top of my head, like Vans the Amiga, so Joel Van Moore, who's another Mitcham local, you know, Seb Humphreys, Order 55, like all of these big name artists, Cab 101, they've all come from graph backgrounds. You know, Jimmy C, like so Jimmy and I have collaborated. He lives in London now, painted the David Bowie wall in Brixton. All of those guys grew up spraying trains in the rail corridor. Like that's where they honed their craft. So, you know, it's interesting because you get like lots of comments about, oh, it's so much better to see, you know, this street art than graffiti. It's like, well, you know, actually this street art wouldn't exist if it weren't for those early forerunners that, you know, like really built that movement.
Yeah, yes, it's fascinating.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, talk about the particular, there's a few thumbs up as well from our viewers on those views. I've read that you said that your artwork describes your personal connection to the Central Australian landscape. I'd love to know more about that personal connection you have with that. And is that part of the times you've spent there? Is it family? What aspects are there to it?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's you know, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, country and that concept of country and landscape it's so deeply enmeshed within your personhood. It's you know, you are part of the landscape and the landscape is a part of you, and it's, you know, those two things, you know, go together, and you know, they're sort of inextricably linked. So my practice very much is something that, you know, speaks to connection to country. And, you know, I speak to that in a number of ways, you know, in palette, in shape, in mark making, in lots of different ways. And, you know, it does speak directly to the landscape, but it also speaks to the songlines that forge the landscape and the ancestral stories and those storylines that run through it. It also, you know, it does reference family and those connections as well. So yeah, I think, you know, country means it's such an overwhelmingly large beast, you know, that is just, is such an important part of, you know, what I do.
Yes, and that 1 year that you spent with your husband and your young child, is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, 2014
Was that a
we moved home.
significant period, and in what way was it significant?
Yeah, well, it was actually, so my family, so my grandmother was forcibly removed, and so there was a lot of like that loss of connection to like country and culture in my family growing up. Obviously, always knew I was Aboriginal. We always, like, my dad, you know, my father's Aboriginal. Always knew that, but there was always missing pieces. And there was also, and it's hard because, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there was a lot of shame for my grandmother, and so she didn't really want to disclose a lot of stuff until she was much older. And so, you know, it kind of got to the point where I was like, I need to know this. I need this information to feel complete. I need to know who I am. And so, you know, when she, you know, was very, you know, on her deathbed, really gave me some information that I could, you know, like, take forward. And so we moved home to the APY we then had two of our three children. My husband's a teacher, so he secured a job up in Armata teaching. And so we went back, you know, with the whole premise of returning to country, you know, so that I could, you know, reconnect with family, so that my children could be immersed in their culture and learn their language and that sort of stuff. And so we went home to country. And, you know, it's like, I don't know, anyone that's sort of spent any time around Aboriginal people, like the blackfella, you know, grapevine is pretty strong. And, you know, it didn't take long of, like, you know, obviously me, you know, talking to, you know, Anangu women, and particularly elders, about who, you know, what I know of my story, for them to know, because they've got like an absolute mud map in their heads of who is related to whom. And, you know, Aboriginal kinship, and particularly Anangu kinship, is so complex. They know it all. To go, okay, yep, I know exactly who this is. And so I was working at Jala Arts, so the art centre up in Armata, and this on this one particular day, I was helping out there, and an Anangu woman with, you know, like bright purple hair, like with a kangaroo tail, mala whipper, like flung over her shoulder, walks in and says, "Oh, your family's here." And I said, "Oh, okay," thinking, you know, it might have been like Matt and the kids had come to visit. Anyway, so I go out, and there's a van that's pulled up out front, and it was like a clown car, like the door opened and like 15 Anangu come spilling out. And she said, "This is your family." And I said, for a minute, I was just so shocked. And then, you know, lastly, this old Jilpy, old fella, gets out of the car, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and it was just an absolute darker skinned dead ringer for my dad. And I went, "Oh my," and he just looked at me and he said, "Your grandmother, that was my sister." And so we all just like, I just like tears pouring down my face. Remember I'm in goosebumps thinking about it this time. And I looked around, and they're like, "Yeah, you know, this is your family. We are your family." And so he'd driven all the way down from Mutijulu, which is the community around Uluru. And so he actually lives up there. And so I went and met him out on country out in the homelands at Cave Hill. And, you know, we sat and just talked for hours about, and, you know, he was explaining to me, you know, this is our family's dreaming, you know, this is your Anangu name, you know, this is all the information, you know, and me as well. He wanted to know from me, like, what happened to, you know, your grandmother, like, you know, where is she now, like what did she do with her life? Because of course he'd had no connection with her since she was 4 years old. That was the last time he'd seen her. So that connection to country, and that, I've forgotten what the question was, but anyway, that connection to country and that connection to family was just, yeah, like life-changing, absolutely life-changing for me. And that I think was definitely reflected in my arts practice.
And who cares what the question was? And are you finding amongst the Aboriginals community that these reconnections are happening now?
For me personally, or just generally speaking?
Just generally amongst others, you know, because, you know, it's a wonderful story to think if there's the reconnecting after the disconnection that has occurred.
Yeah,
it's a hopeful.
I think so. And I mean, you know, there are organisations that are striving to do that, you know, like Link Up and organisations that are striving to sort of patch that back together, you know, for you know, stolen generation families and survivors. And I think as well, you know, young Aboriginal people are you know, growing up and needing to know. You know, I need to know. You know, gone are the days, I think, where we could sort of just like, you know, cast aside a child as, oh yeah, we know they're Aboriginal, but you know, their language group and their family group and their kinship isn't really, you know, instrumental. It's not important. It is important, and we need to start trying to, you know, heal from that and put that back together so that we can then go from healing to striving, to, you know, thriving. Yeah.
Some more thumbs up and claps as well, so thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions. Before a question, Matthew noted you were mentioning about Jimmy C moving from the street art world.
Yeah, he did.
To it world.
Yeah, he did. He went on to do, you're right, Matthew, he did. Yeah, he went on to do a master's in visual art. Cool. And it's interesting because Jimmy and I are really good friends, and we've had many a chat over, you know, a Belgian beer when we were sitting in France and talking about that. And you know, I guess, you know, that actually, you know, is really just, you know, instrument, like it just explains beautifully, you know, that the background and the origins of street art, and that, you know, all art is legitimate, and all pathways into art are legitimate. So, you know, I mean, I don't know if you ever paid attention to the freight trains that go past, but there's some seriously impressive work on them. Even if it's not your cup of tea, you know, you can still admire the technical detail that goes into it. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, like Jimmy went from that, you know, background and a very graph background, you know, to this incredible, you know, abstract sort of impressionist, you know, pointillism, which is just incredible. So yeah.
There's a question from Margaret and Alan about pavement art using chalk, and you know, the 3D art where you stand in one particular place and you get that. They note that it's popular in Europe but not in Australia. Do you know why not?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's one that I don't have you know, an immediate answer for. I mean, I guess from where I've seen it a lot in places like you know, in, you know, like New York and Paris and London, around sort of, you know, where there's lots of people milling around. So I guess I don't know, I would be throwing caution to the wind, and I don't really have a good answer to that. But yeah, you're right, and it's really cool. Like, it's really impressive, some of that pavement art. And
it's quite mathematical because it's serious perspective work. You're talking about the tricks and skills in scaling up, and like you just learn by doing them. And there's similar skills in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there is one in Hindley Street near the universities. There's a place where you stand and you can actually see it's painted on the pavement.
Oh yes, that was painted by Aurelia Cabone. Yeah, that I really love that piece of artwork. It's looking a bit haggard now, and in fact, I reckon they might have even painted over it, because the plan was to actually, they were going to put a mural on that, because I reckon it's like an SA Power Networks building or something like that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I really love that piece. Yeah, I guess it's always going to have wear and tear, but then you know, so it's not going to last forever. And chalk as a medium is very, you know, the work is always going to be very ephemeral and very, you know, temporary and transient, which is kind of cool in itself in a different way. But yeah, it is really cool. And I've been loving, like, you know, even the school kids getting in on, like, during, you know, the isolation, doing the you know, chalk murals on the ground. I love it. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Some more questions. Is there a particular type of paint that you use?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I use a particular brand of paint called Resine, which is, there's only one South Australian distributor, and she is located on Unley Road at the local paint shop. I use that stuff because it's low odor and it's really durable, and it's like an exterior quality paint, but in the most incredible, like, studio artist colors. So it kind of tends to be the street artist's paint of choice. I mean, you can use, you know, any old wall paint, you know, preferably exterior if it's exterior, but, you know, again, it's only gonna, the longevity of it wouldn't, you know, change drastically if you used interior paint. But yeah, so any kind of wall paint will work, but Resine has, like, the particularly vibrant colors that I tend to use for my work.
Okay, yeah. And sealing, like weather protection, and like there is this notion of an anti-graffiti coating as well.
Yeah sometimes. Look, and sometimes, you know, 9 times out of 10, it isn't really necessary, particularly depending on where you do it. I don't, as a general rule, seal mine, unless it's kind of, you know, stipulated in the, you know, maybe if it's been commissioned by, let's say it's been commissioned by a council, and that's, they specifically want the artist to do that. Quite often council dipty, you know, they'll get the artist in, the artist will conduct the work, and then a couple of days later they'll get a contractor in to come and seal it with some anti-graffiti coating, particularly for dipty if it's around train stations, because that stuff does occasionally get hit, and so it just saves, you know, like you can just sort of wipe it off. Yeah, UV is another probably better reason to seal artwork, to be honest, because paint does fade, and you know, you can put a UV coating and you can get like a UV and graffiti coating that in one that kind of will protect the artwork and just give it, you know, just that couple of years longer life, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. And look into the future. Where would you like your practice to head to? Have you got sort of themes or styles that you'd like to explore?
Yeah, I want to go big. I like the biggest works that I've done would be the one at Tea Tree Plaza, which was, I think, about 5 stories by about 72 meters, and that was a collaboration with another artist named Georgia Hill, who also works on monstrous scales. You know, so I'm really keen to kind of tackle some of that really big stuff, which, you know, I think would be amazing. I'd really love to be able to take my practice and build upon it outside of South Australia. Like, I love working locally, but it's also really awesome as well to take your practice out of, you know, out of your comfort zone. And so I've got a couple of projects coming up interstate, you know, that probably would have gone ahead about around now-ish if, you know, the lockdowns and stuff hadn't happened. And you know, and also a project overseas that has been sort of postponed kind of indefinitely. So I guess, yeah, I'd really like to go big, and I'd like to take my practice back overseas. And, you know, because I think it's, you know, it's hard to say this without sounding a bit full of myself, but I guess, you know, there aren't really enough Aboriginal artists working in the public art space, and there aren't, I mean, and I think that's, you know, we need to have more, and we need to encourage that. But I think what I do is reasonably unique in terms of creating Aboriginal art on the scale that I do, and I'd really love to be able to take that overseas and interstate, and really, because the reason why I do what I do is to increase the visibility of Aboriginal arts and culture broadly. You know, sometimes we can be a bit missing from the discourse, or that discourse can be really, you know, negative and stereotyped. You know, what I strive to do is put Aboriginal art in the public space unapologetically, rip it off the walls of the galleries and the wealthy, put it in the public space for everyone to enjoy and for everyone to see past the headlines and look a bit deeper and think a bit deeper about Aboriginal arts and culture. And so that is why I do what I do. So that's why I want to take it, you know, interstate and overseas, you know, for the challenge, to scale it up, you know, make it bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, to really kind of hammer down that notion of, you know, we are the oldest continuing culture on the face of the earth, and we are first Australians, and we need to acknowledge that. And so we need to, you know, acknowledge that in a big way. And yeah, so that's, I guess, where I want to take my practice.
Wow, that's fantastic, and I hope we get to see that. There's a couple more questions. I might combine them. Where can people see some of your recent works, and do you offer school workshops and workshops for primary schools?
Yeah, I do. I don't do a lot of workshops, but I certainly do some. Yeah, absolutely. And I've got about, I've lost the count. I think it's definitely over 30. There's a few in the CBD. Out at City of Port Adelaide Enfield Council are, you know, amazing when it comes to the arts, and really, you know, they really champion the arts, and particularly Aboriginal arts, because they've got a large Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population out there. So I reckon I've got about 3 or 4 might even be 5 out that way in their council. I've the Prospect Library, that'd be another one, and I think I've got another one out at Prospect, and there's a few in the city. Tea Tree Plaza is the biggest one that I have, which is out at the shopping centre out there, and I've also got one in Brisbane and one in France.
Yes, it's fantastic. And just as we wrap up, the final questions I'd like to ask you is your experiences through the pandemic. What things about the recent experience would you like to hang on to, and what things are you itching to get back to when the pandemic ends?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic's been hard, and I think, and it's certainly not just for me, it's been hard for all artists. You know, I've had so many projects, you know, postponed indefinitely, you know, so that's been hard. But at the same time, it's actually really been lovely to pause and to stop and actually invest back into my studio practice a little bit, because that's something I think that gets like a little bit neglected, you know, in the hustle of creating all of this large scale stuff. You know, I've also got a studio practice, and, you know, I have, you know, exhibitions coming up, and I haven't actually really had enough time to actually really sit down and dig deep and really, you know, like dive into that. And so that having the, you know, opportunity to do that has actually been really, really nice. You know, so, you know, there's whilst I'm super itching, you know, just to get back out there, and was like absolutely ecstatic to be able to get back onto a boom this week to create that work in Blackwood. You know, it has also been nice to just sit and really reflect and you know, pour into that studio practice a bit more.
Thanks. And today, Elizabeth, it's been wonderful to learn more about your art, the history, the stories, and so anybody who's driving up Shepherd's Hill Road now can see your latest work.
You can't miss it.
To understand that the history and the reconnections that you've made, and it's just wonderful. So thank you so much today. We'll put this up line so people can come and revisit what we've heard today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome. Thank you.
Thanks very much.